The message arrived on a Tuesday, which later struck everyone as oddly mundane for the beginning of a galactic war. It came screaming across every frequency that humanity had ever used: radio, quantum burst, tight beam laser, even the old analog channels that no one had touched in decades. And it carried with it the weight of an empire that had crushed 400 species beneath its heel without ever breaking a sweat. The Var-Rokai Dominion had come to collect. In the cold darkness beyond Neptune's orbit, 3,000 warships materialized out of faster-than-light transit, like a curtain of iron being drawn across the stars. And at the center of that armada sat the flagship known as the Edict of Silence, a vessel so large that it had its own gravitational pull, a ship the size of a small moon that had been built for one purpose and one purpose only: to make entire civilizations understand that resistance was not just futile, but genuinely stupid. Declaration they broadcast was ancient, a thing of ritual, spoken in a tone that carried the confidence of 10,000 years of unbroken conquest. You are addressed by the eternal Var-Rokai Dominion, sovereign of the 12,000 stars and keeper of the galactic order, the voice began, deep and resonant and utterly without mercy. You have been observed, you have been measured, you have been found sufficient for service. You are hereby granted the honor of submission. You will dismantle your military forces. You will surrender your governing bodies. You will accept your designation as a tithe species of the Dominion, and you will do so within 72 standard galactic hours. Failure to comply will result in the systematic reduction of your worlds to uninhabitable rock. This is not a negotiation. This is your only notice. Across the galaxy, 400 species heard this broadcast and shuddered, because every single one of them had heard those same words before. And every single one of them had learned what happened when you said no. The Nethari had said no, and they had lasted 6 hours before their council broke and begged on their knees. The Draelkin had said no with real conviction, mounting a defense that the galaxy still whispered about with admiration, and they had lasted 7 days before the Dominion turned their beautiful blue homeworld into a sphere of molten glass that still glowed in the dark of space like a wound that would never heal. No one resisted the Dominion, not anymore, not for a very long time. On Earth, in a bunker buried 300 meters beneath the Swiss Alps, the War Council of the United Stellar Command gathered around a long table made of reclaimed oak, and the air was thick with tension as the message played for the third time on the main display. Admirals and generals sat in rigid silence, their faces carved from stone, while diplomats clutched their tablets and tried to calculate. How many billions of lives hung in the balance of whatever decision was about to be made? The room was so quiet that you could hear the hum of the ventilation system and the faint click of someone nervously tapping their pen against the table. Admiral Lena Vasquez stood at the head of the room, a woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight braid, and the kind of face that had been weathered by 30 years of service in the black. And she listened to the declaration one more time, with her arms crossed and her head slightly tilted, the way a person might listen to a child telling a very elaborate lie. When the message finished, the silence returned, heavier than before. Every eye in the room was on her. Vasquez uncrossed her arms, placed both hands flat on the table, and leaned forward. And then she laughed. It started as a snort, a sharp, undignified sound that escaped through her nose before she could stop it. Then it became a chuckle, and then a full, deep belly laugh that echoed off the concrete walls and made several of the diplomats look at each other in alarm. "I am sorry," she managed between breaths, waving one hand. "I am sorry. It is just, did he actually say honor of submission?" Did anyone else catch that? General Marcus Cole, who had been sitting with his jaw clenched so hard it looked like it might crack, felt his lips twitch against his will. "He did say that," Cole confirmed, and his voice cracked halfway through, and then he was laughing too. It spread like a virus. Admiral Preet Kaur pressed her hand over her mouth, but her shoulders were shaking, and Secretary of Defense Tomas Herrera let out a wheeze that sounded like a balloon deflating, and within 30 seconds, the entire War Council of the United Stellar Command, the body responsible for the defense of 12 billion human lives, was laughing so hard that several people had tears streaming down their faces. Somewhere in the room, a young lieutenant who had been serving coffee dropped a cup and did not even notice, because he was doubled over with his hands on his knees. It was not the laughter of people who did not understand the danger. It was the laughter of people who understood it perfectly and had decided in the deepest part of themselves that fear was boring. Aboard the Edict of Silence, Overseer Kethvalan of the Varokai stood before his own command display and watched the human response with all four of his compound eyes unblinking. He was tall, even by Varokai standards, nearly 3 meters of armored chitin and muscle, with mandibles that could crush stone, and a mind that had orchestrated the subjugation of 11 species personally. And in his long and decorated career, he had seen every possible response to the Declaration of Submission. He had seen species weep and beg and offer their children as tribute. He had seen species rage and snarl and promise wars they could never win. He had seen species go silent with the terrible understanding of their own helplessness. He had never, in 400 declarations delivered across 6,000 years of Dominion history, seen a species laugh. "What are they doing?" his second-in-command asked, leaning closer to the display, as if proximity might help him understand. Kethvalan did not answer immediately. He watched the silver-haired human female, the one they had identified as the ranking military commander, wipe tears from her eyes and steady herself against the table, still grinning, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He was not sure it was concern exactly, but it was something adjacent to it, something cold that settled in the space between his hearts. "Overseer," his communications officer interrupted, "the humans are opening a return channel." Kethvalan straightened and clicked his mandibles twice, the Varokai equivalent of bracing oneself. The display flickered, and Admiral Vasquez appeared on screen, her face flushed, her eyes still bright with amusement, and behind her, the entire War Council was visible. Faces. She looked directly into the camera with a smile that contained no surrender and no fear and no bluff. Just the pure and radiant confidence of a species that had crawled out of the mud and split the atom and walked on its own moon, and nearly destroyed itself a dozen times, and survived every single time because it was simply too stubborn and too ridiculous to die. "You have got yourself a war, big guy," she said, and her voice was steady and warm and completely unafraid. "Hope you packed a lunch." The channel closed. Kethvalan stood motionless for a long time. Around him his bridge crew exchanged glances, waiting for orders, waiting for the fury that always followed defiance. But the overseer simply stared at the blank screen with an expression that none of them had ever seen on his face before. Finally, his second-in-command spoke again, carefully. "Overseer, are they insane?" Kethvalan turned slowly, his massive frame casting a shadow across the command deck, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than any of them had ever heard it. "No," he said. "That is what concerns me. I believe they are enjoying this." And out beyond Neptune, the stars burned cold and silent, indifferent to the war that was about to reshape every corner of the galaxy. A war that began not with a cry of defiance or a plea for mercy, but with the one sound the mighty Dominion had never learned to answer. The 72-hour countdown had barely begun when humanity did the first thing that made the entire galaxy question whether they had lost their minds. They broadcast everything. Every war plan, every fleet movement, every tactical discussion, every logistics calculation, all of it, transmitted on open channels for anyone in the galaxy to hear, including, and especially, the Varokai Dominion. In the Intelligence Center, aboard the Edict of Silence, Dominion analysts sat before their screens in stunned confusion as terabytes of human military data poured through their systems like a river breaking through a dam. And for the first 6 hours, they were absolutely certain it was disinformation, an elaborate web of false plans designed to misdirect the Armada. They ran every decryption algorithm they had, searched for hidden patterns and buried codes, cross-referenced the data against observed human fleet positions, and what they found shook them in a way that no one could have anticipated. Species had ever managed before. It was all real. Every single piece of it was genuine. The humans had simply decided that they did not care if the enemy knew what was coming. Dominion senior analyst Velthara stared at her display for so long without blinking that her subordinates began to worry she had entered a catatonic state. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular hollow quality of someone whose entire understanding of warfare had just been turned inside out. "They are not hiding anything," she said. "They are daring us to try and stop them." Across the galaxy, the reaction was equally bewildered, but for different reasons. Ambassadors from dozens of neutral species sent private messages to the human diplomatic corps, pleading with them to surrender before it was too late, offering to mediate, begging them to see reason. And every single one of these messages received a response from Ambassador Joaquin Meade. Kind of response anyone expected. The Nethari ambassador received an image of a small Earth dog sitting in a room that was clearly on fire, holding a cup of a hot beverage with text that read, "This is fine." The Pelori trade delegate received a video of a human child falling off a small-wheeled device, getting up immediately and riding it straight into a second fall. The Draelkin ambassador, whose species had suffered more under the Dominion than almost any other, received a message that simply said, "Watch what happens next," followed by a small yellow circular face with one eye closed in what humans apparently called a wink. The Draelkin ambassador forwarded the image to his intelligence team, who studied it for 3 hours and ultimately classified it as a potential cognitohazard, a psychological weapon designed to destabilize rational thought, which was, in a way, not entirely wrong. Meanwhile, inside the Dominion command structure, a different kind of unease was taking root. Kethvalon had ordered his researchers to compile a full species profile on humanity, something that was normally done years before a declaration of submission was issued. But the Dominion had considered humans so insignificant, a species that had only been in space for 80 years, that they had not bothered with a thorough analysis. That was turning out to be a mistake. The profile that landed on Kethvalon's desk was unlike anything in the Dominion archives, and as he read it, the cold feeling that had settled between his hearts during the humans' first transmission began to spread. Humans, it turned out, had been at war with themselves for their entire recorded history. Not border skirmishes or territorial disputes of the kind that most species experienced during their pre-spaceflight development. Real, sustained, industrialized war, the kind that consumed entire continents and killed millions and reshaped the surface of their world. They had invented a weapon that could crack atoms apart and release enough energy to flatten a city. And then, instead of recoiling in horror and locking it away, they had built thousands more and pointed them at each other, as a form of diplomacy that they cheerfully called mutually assured destruction. They had developed military doctrines with names that had no equivalent in any Dominion language: guerrilla warfare, scorched earth, total war, psychological operations, asymmetric combat, concepts so alien to the Dominion's way of thinking that the translation software kept flagging them as errors. No species in the Dominion's long history had ever arrived at the stars pre-seasoned for galactic war. But that was exactly what humanity was. a species that had spent 10,000 years sharpening itself against the only opponent available, which was itself. Kethvalan closed the report and sat in silence for a long time. Then the first battle happened, and it was worse than he had imagined. The Overseer had ordered a preliminary strike on a small human border colony called New Svalbard, a settlement of roughly 8,000 souls on a frozen world at the edge of human space, as a demonstration of Dominion power, and a warning to any other species that might be watching and getting ideas. The strike force consisted of 40 warships and 12 troop carriers, more than enough to flatten a minor colony, and when they arrived in orbit, their scans showed the settlement below. Prefabricated buildings, atmospheric processors, a small spaceport, exactly where intelligence said it would be. The troops landed in perfect formation, breached the colony perimeter, moved through the corridors with the mechanical efficiency of soldiers who had done this hundreds of times before, and found the colony completely empty. Every human was gone. The buildings were stripped of anything useful, the data cores were wiped clean, and the atmospheric processors had been set to a timer that would shut them down in 6 hours, which meant that even the air itself was temporary. What the Dominion soldiers did find, stacked neatly in what had once been the colony's main warehouse, was a collection of roughly 4,000 rubber chickens. These were small, brightly colored synthetic objects, shaped like earth poultry, and when squeezed, they produced a shrill squeaking sound that was apparently considered humorous by human children. Alongside the rubber chickens was a set of audio speakers playing a looped message in the Dominion trade language, delivered in a cheerful human voice. "Welcome to the party. Refreshments are behind you." The Dominion commander turned around. Behind the landing force, in the space between the troop carriers and the planet's thin atmosphere, 8 human stealth frigates decloaked simultaneously, then 2 kilometers from the Dominion fleet, and opened fire. The battle lasted 11 minutes. The human frigates moved like nothing the Dominion pilots had ever seen, not in formation, but in a kind of controlled chaos, weaving between the larger Dominion ships with a recklessness that bordered on suicidal, firing kinetic lances at point-blank range, and then vanishing back into stealth before the return fire could track them. 14 Dominion ships were destroyed, 3 more were crippled beyond repair, and by the time the remaining vessels regrouped and launched a coordinated counterattack, the human frigates had simply disappeared into the black. The ground troops were recalled, covered in a fine dust from the colony's environmental systems, that turned out to be a harmless but extremely persistent dye that stained their armor bright pink and would not wash off for weeks. On the bridge of the Edict of Silence, Kethvalan reviewed the after-action report in silence, while his officers stood at rigid attention, none of them willing to be the first to speak. 14 ships lost in a first contact engagement. It was a negligible number against 3,000. Barely a scratch, but that was not the point. The Dominion had not suffered losses in a first contact action in over 6,000 years, and the fact that it had happened now, against a species that had been in space for less than a single Dominion lifetime, was a crack in the foundation of everything the Armada believed about itself. "Overseer," his second-in-command finally ventured, his voice careful and low, "are the humans insane?" Kethvalan stared at the tactical display where the 8 stealth frigates had appeared and disappeared like ghosts, and he thought about the rubber chickens, and the cheerful voice, and the bright pink dye, and the war plans broadcast on open channels, and the silver-haired admiral who had laughed in his face. "No," he said, slowly, clicking his mandibles in a rhythm that his crew recognized as deep thought. "That is what concerns me. I believe they are enjoying this." He turned from the display and looked out the main viewport at the vast darkness of human space. And somewhere in that darkness, he knew, they were laughing again. And for the first time in a career that had spanned the conquest of 11 species and the subjugation of billions, Overseer Kethvalan of the Va-Rokai Dominion, was not entirely sure that he was the predator in this hunt. 2 weeks into the war, the Dominion Armada pushed deeper into human space with the full and overwhelming force that had broken 400 species before them. And they found something that unsettled them far more than any weapon or fleet or fortification could have. They found nothing. World after world, system after system, the Great Armada arrived to find colonies that had gone dark, settlements stripped to the bones, orbital stations powered down and drifting, cities emptied of every man, woman, and child, as if an entire civilization had simply decided to pick up and leave. And in a sense, that was exactly what had happened. The Dominion was conquering ghosts, planting flags on empty rocks, claiming victory over worlds where the only remaining inhabitants were automated systems that played the same message on loop in a dozen languages. Nobody home. Try again later. Keth Valan stood on the bridge of the Edict of Silence and stared at the strategic display that showed Dominion flags spreading across human space like a blue stain, and he understood with a sickening clarity that every single one of those flags was meaningless. The humans had not stood and fought. They had not formed a defensive line. They had simply melted away like snow in sunlight, and the greatest military force in galactic history was punching at empty air. "Where are they?" he asked, and his voice was quiet enough that only his second-in-command heard him. The answer came 6 hours later, and it came from behind. 3,000 light-years to the rear of the Dominion advance, in the heart of Dominion-controlled space, where no enemy had struck in living memory. A supply depot orbiting the Tive world of Kasara Prime erupted in a chain of explosions that lit up the system like a second sun. A Wolfpack squadron of 12 human destroyers, small, fast, ugly ships that looked like they had been welded together from scrap metal, and pure spite, had crossed through Dominion territory undetected, moving through the gaps between sensor networks with a precision that should have been impossible, and had hit the depot with enough firepower to vaporize 3 months of fleet supplies in under 4 minutes. Before the local garrison could scramble a response, the human ships were already gone, burning hard for their next target, and they were not alone. Across Dominion space, in dozens of systems simultaneously, human Wolfpack squadrons struck with the same brutal efficiency. Communication relays, fuel stations, garrison outposts, sensor arrays, hitting anything that kept the vast machinery of the Dominion running and then vanishing before retaliation could arrive. It was not a battle, it was surgery, and the humans wielded the scalpel with the casual expertise of a species that had been cutting things apart for a very long time. But the strikes were not even the worst part. Part was the broadcasts. Every tithe world that the humans hit received a transmission before the Wolfpacks departed, and it was not a threat or a warning or a demand for surrender. It was an invitation. "You do not have to kneel anymore," the message said, delivered in the local language of whatever species inhabited that world. "The chain is only as strong as you believe it is. We are here, and we are not leaving." The galaxy watched this unfold with a kind of stunned fascination. And slowly, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, the real picture began to emerge. The picture that explained why humanity had laughed when the Dominion came knocking. They had been ready. Not ready for the Dominion specifically. They had not even known that Dominion existed until the Armada appeared. But ready for something. Ready for anything. Ready for the inevitable moment when something bigger and meaner came out of the dark to try and end them. Was the thing about humans that no other species in the galaxy had ever understood. They always assumed the worst was coming. It was baked into their bones, woven into their history, coded into their very DNA by 10,000 years of ice ages and plagues and famines and wars and every other catastrophe that a hostile universe could throw at a small, soft, slow species living on a single fragile world. They called it aggressive preparedness, and it was not a military doctrine so much as it was a way of life. Every colony ship humanity had ever launched was also a warship, fitted with weapon systems hidden behind civilian hull plating that could be activated in minutes. Every space station had military-grade shielding and emergency armories built into the walls behind panels that looked like maintenance access points. Every human settlement, no matter how small or remote, had evacuation plans that were drilled quarterly, supply caches buried beneath their surface, and communication arrays that could reach Earth even if every relay in between was destroyed. And every human child, from the age of 6, learned basic survival skills in school right alongside mathematics and literature. How to purify water, how to navigate by stars, how to build shelter, how to stay calm when everything around you was falling apart. The galaxy had looked at humanity and seen a young, naive species that had barely taken its first steps into the void. Humanity had looked at the void and seen a place full of things that wanted to kill them and had prepared accordingly. Now all that preparation was being unleashed, and the Dominion was learning a lesson that the universe had been trying to teach for millennia. Do not corner something that has spent its entire existence preparing to be cornered. On the tithe world of Quelhar, a planet of rolling green meadows and shallow warm seas, were a gentle six-limbed herbivorous species called. The Quelhari had been enslaved for 2,000 years. Something extraordinary happened. A human marine dropship broke through the atmosphere at 3 in the morning local time, landed in a field outside the largest population center, and disgorged not soldiers but crates, dozens of them, stacked neatly in the grass with instruction manuals printed in the Quelhari language. Inside were weapons, shield generators, communication equipment, medical supplies, and a small holographic projector that activated automatically when the last crate was opened. The projection showed a human woman in marine armor, scarred and tired and smiling, and she spoke in Quelhari with an accent that was terrible but understandable. "My name is Sergeant Priya Anand of the United Stellar Command," she said. "We cannot promise you that you will win. We cannot promise that it will be easy or safe or painless. But we can promise you this: you will not fight alone. Not today, not ever." The projection ended, and for a long moment the Quelhari who had gathered around the crates stood in silence, looking at each other with their wide, dark eyes. And then the eldest among them, a female named Tolessa, who still bore the scars of the Dominion's branding iron on her back, reached into a crate and picked up a weapon for the first time in her people's history. The Quelhari uprising began that morning, and within 48 hours it had tied down 200 Dominion warships that were desperately needed at the front. Meanwhile, Admiral Vasquez executed the operation she had been planning since the day the Dominion arrived, a coordinated masterpiece of chaos that her staff had codenamed Operation Laughing Ghost. Using stealth ships, electronic warfare suites, and a form of weaponized misinformation that the Dominion's intelligence services had never even conceived of, Vasquez fed false sensor data to 2 separate Dominion fleet groups, operating in adjacent systems, each one showing a massive human attack force bearing down on their position from the direction of the other fleet group. Both fleet groups opened fire on what they believed was an enemy armada. They were shooting at each other. 140 Dominion warships were destroyed in the crossfire before a single officer realized what had happened. And by the time the shooting stopped and the terrible truth became clear, the human stealth ships that had orchestrated the entire deception had long since disappeared into the void, leaving behind nothing but wreckage and shame. When Kethvalen received the report, he read it 3 times before setting it down on his desk with the careful precision of someone handling an explosive device. "How?" he asked his intelligence chief. The officer swallowed hard. "The humans made us see enemies that were not there, Overseer. They turned our own sensors into weapons against us. Keth-Valan said nothing for a very long time. And across the galaxy, in the quiet corners and dark places where enslaved species had long since given up on freedom, a new word was spreading. A human word, small and fragile and more dangerous than any weapon the Dominion had ever faced. Hope. 2 months into the war, for the first time in 3,000 years, the supreme hegemon of the Varokai Dominion authorized the deployment of the Axiom Fleet. The order traveled through encrypted channels that had not been used in millennia, activating systems buried so deep in the Dominion's military infrastructure that most serving officers did not even know they existed. And when the Axiom Fleet woke from its ancient slumber in the hidden docks beneath the Dominion throne world, the tremor was felt across half the planet. The Axiom Fleet was not a military force in any conventional sense. It was a geological event with engines, 47 capital ships, each one carrying weapons that could sterilize an entire star system, built during a darker age when the Dominion had faced threats that made the current war look like a playground disagreement, and held in reserve for the single scenario that the Dominion feared above all others: its rule. The Axiom Fleet had been deployed exactly twice before. The first time, it had ended a war against a coalition of 60 species in a single afternoon. The second time, it had cracked the homeworld of the Scythene collective so thoroughly that the Scythene had retreated into a pocket of space and had not spoken to another living being in 4,000 years. Now it was being aimed at a species that had been traveling between stars for less than a century. And that fact alone, the sheer absurdity that such a thing was necessary, burned in Keth-Valan's chest like acid. When the intelligence reached humanity, the laughter stopped. Admiral Vasquez received the report in the medical bay of the carrier Defiance, where she was being treated for injuries sustained during a skirmish near the Vega system, and she read it on a tablet while a medic sealed a gash on her forearm with synthetic skin. She read it again. Then she set the tablet down and stared at the ceiling for a full minute. And the medic who was treating her later said that it was the only time during the entire war that he saw fear in her eyes. Not for herself, but for the 12 billion people whose survival rested on decisions she had not yet figured out how to make. She called a war council within the hour. The meeting was held aboard the Defiance because there was no time to return to Earth, and the faces that appeared on the holographic display were haggard and worn, in a way they had not been 2 months ago. Not broken, not defeated, but carrying the weight of a war that had demanded everything and was about to demand more. Vasquez laid it out plainly, because she had never believed in softening the truth. The Axiom Fleet can sterilize star systems, she said. We have nothing that can match that kind of firepower, not even close. If they deploy it against our core worlds, we lose. The silence that followed was heavy and complete, the kind of silence that has its own gravity. General Cole was the first to speak, his voice rough. Then we need to make sure they never reach our core worlds. They will reach them, Vasquez said flatly. We do not have the ships to stop them in open space. The math does not work, Marcus. It never did. More silence. Then Captain Davi Akafor, who was 29 years old and had been a tactical theory instructor at the academy before the war turned theory into practice, leaned forward in his chair and spoke with the quiet certainty of someone who had been running numbers in his head for days. We cannot outgun it, he said, but we can make destroying us cost them everything they have left. Every eye turned to him. If the Axiom Fleet destroys us, Okafor continued, the Dominion wins and goes back to business as usual. That is the scenario we have to prevent. Not our destruction, that might be unavoidable, but the part where things go back to normal afterward. We need to make sure that even if we fall, the Dominion falls with us. Vasquez studied him for a long moment, and then a smile crossed her face. Not the bright, defiant grin she had worn when she declared war, but something deeper, something that hurt. "Tell me," she said, "what Captain Okafor proposed and what the War Council unanimously approved 16 minutes later became known as the Prometheus Gambit." Humanity began transmitting every piece of military technology it possessed to every subjugated species in the Dominion, not through covert channels, not encrypted, not hidden, but openly, freely, and with detailed instruction manuals translated into 400 languages. FTL disruptor blueprints went to the Quelhari, who were already in open revolt. Shield harmonic frequencies went to the Draelkin survivors, who had been living as refugees on borrowed worlds for generations. Kinetic lance designs, stealth field generator, schematics, electronic warfare algorithms, ship construction guides, weapons manufacturing processes. Everything humanity had built or borrowed or invented in its 80 years among the stars was given away in a single act of technological generosity that had no precedent in galactic history. The message that accompanied the data was simple and devastating. "This is everything we have. Build it, use it. They can kill us, but they cannot kill what we have given you." The Dominion's intelligence services realized what was happening almost immediately, but they were powerless to stop it. The data was propagating too fast, spreading through underground networks and resistance cells and smuggler routes that the Dominion had never been able to fully suppress. And every hour that passed meant another species, another world, another population arming itself with weapons that had been designed to fight gods. Keth Valan saw the strategic implications with perfect clarity. For the first time in the war, he felt something that he would later recognize as respect. The humans had turned their own destruction into a weapon, because even if the Axiom fleet burned every human world to cinders, the Dominion would emerge from the war facing 400 species armed with human technology and human fury, and the unshakable knowledge that resistance was possible, because they had seen a tiny, young, ridiculous species stand against the mightiest empire in the galaxy and spit in its eye. Simultaneously, on the far side of the galaxy, a different gambit was playing out. Sergeant Priya Anand, the same Marine who had delivered weapons to the Quelhari, had been chosen for a mission that required something rarer than courage, something that could not be found in any military manual: the ability to make someone care. The Scythian Collective had not spoken to the outside galaxy in 4,000 years, not since the Dominion had cracked their world and driven them into a pocket of space surrounded by defense platforms that destroyed anything that approached. Anand's ship was the size of a shuttle, unarmed, broadcasting a universal peace signal on all frequencies, and she flew it straight through the Scythian defense perimeter, knowing that the platforms would either let her through or reduce her to atoms. They let her through, though whether out of curiosity or something else, she never learned. The Scythian who met her were ancient and strange and beautiful, crystalline beings who communicated through resonance, their bodies chiming like bells when they spoke, and they regarded her with the weary indifference of a species that had seen too much and decided that none of it mattered anymore. "We know of your war," the Scythian High Resonance said, its body singing in frequencies that Anand felt in her chest. "We know of the Dominion. We have no interest in the affairs of the galaxy. We paid our price long ago." Anand, who had a shrapnel scar that ran from her left temple to her jaw, and who had held a dying Quelhari child in her arms 2 weeks earlier, looked at the ancient crystalline being and spoke with a voice that did not waver. "I am not asking you to fight for us," she said. "We can handle our own dying. I am asking you to fight for the ones who cannot fight for themselves, the species that the Dominion has spent 10,000 years grinding into dust, the ones who are rising up right now for the first time in their history, because someone finally showed them that it was possible. They need help, not our help, they have that already. They need yours. They need to know that the galaxy has not forgotten them." The High Resonance was silent for a long time, its body dimming, until it was barely visible in the chamber's low light. "You are a strange species," it said at last. "We get that a lot," Anand replied. The Axiom fleet arrived at the human core system of Elysium 3 days later, and the battle that followed was the most violent single engagement in recorded galactic history. Humanity threw everything it had into the defense. Every ship, every station, every armed transport, and converted freighter, and jury-rigged weapons platform that could point a gun at the sky. And the Axiom fleet met them with the kind of firepower that turned space itself into a killing field. The battle lasted 19 hours. Humanity lost half its remaining fleet in the first 6. Elysium's orbital stations burned and broke apart, raining debris onto the planet below like a meteor shower that would not end. And the sky above the colony's capital city turned orange, and then red, and then a bruised purple that the survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. But the humans held the line. Not because they could win. They knew they could not. But because every hour they held was another hour for the uprisings to spread, another hour for the technology to propagate, another hour for Priya Anand's words to echo through the chambers of the Scythian collective. They held because holding was all they had left, and it was enough. When the Defiance finally broke apart under sustained fire from 3 Axiom dreadnoughts, Admiral Vasquez broadcast one final message from the wreckage of her bridge, her face bloodied, her uniform torn, the emergency lighting casting her in shades of red and shadow. "You spent 10,000 years building an empire out of fear," she said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that burned like the stars outside her shattered viewport. "We are going to tear it down with stubbornness. Your move." The transmission ended, and in the silence that followed, across 400 worlds, 400 species held their breath and waited for what came next. The Dominion was not losing. That was the official position, repeated in every communique, and stamped on every briefing document, and broadcast on every propaganda channel that the Va-Rokai controlled. And in the strictest technical sense, it was true. The Dominion still held the largest fleet, the most territory, and the greatest industrial capacity of any power in the galaxy. But the Dominion was not winning either. And for an empire that had built its entire identity on the assumption that it could never be seriously challenged, not winning was the same as losing. The numbers told a story that no amount of propaganda could rewrite. 197 subject species were now in open revolt, armed with human weapons and burning with a fury that had been building for centuries. And the uprisings were spreading faster than the Dominion could suppress them, because every time a garrison was pulled from one world to crush a rebellion, 2 more worlds rose up behind it. The supply lines that had fed the Dominion war machine for millennia were collapsing, severed by human wolf-pack squadrons, and sabotaged by resistance cells that had memorized every vulnerability in the system, because humans had helpfully broadcast the locations alongside the weapons schematics. Tithe worlds that had once produced the raw materials of empire were burning Dominion flags in their public squares, and tearing down the statues of Va-Rokai overseers that had loomed over their cities for generations. And on the bridge of the Edict of Silence, Overseer Kethvaland watched it all unravel with the quiet composure of someone who had already accepted what was happening, even if he could not yet bring himself to name it. Then the Scythene broke their silence, and the war entered its final act. The Scythene collective did not send a fleet. They had not maintained a military force in 4,000 years, and they had no intention of starting now. But what they sent was infinitely more destructive than any weapon. They broadcast the Dominion's origin archive. This was a document that the Va-Rokai had suppressed so thoroughly that even most senior Dominion officials did not know it existed. A historical record from the earliest days of the species, preserved in Scythian archives from a time when the 2 civilizations had been neighbors rather than enemies. The archive told a story that shattered the very foundation of Dominion ideology. The Varokai had not always been conquerors. They had once been conquered. 12,000 years ago, the Varokai had been a subject species themselves, enslaved by a now extinct empire called the Torvathi, forced to mine and build and fight and die for masters who considered them barely more than animals. And they had endured this for centuries, until a Varokai revolutionary named Keth the Unbroken had led an uprising that toppled the Torvathi, freed his people. And then, in the cruelest irony in galactic history, the liberated Varokai had looked at the empire of their former masters and decided not to dismantle it, but to claim it, to become the very thing that had oppressed them, because power was easier to hold than to release, and because fear was the only language they had ever been taught. The Dominion was not a civilization. It was a cycle of abuse stretching back 12,000 years, a chain of pain in which the enslaved became the enslaver, and every generation forgot a little more of the truth until the lie became sacred. When the archive hit the galactic networks, the effect was immediate and devastating. On Dominion warships across 100 fronts, officers who had spent their lives believing in the divine right of the Varokai to rule read the truth about their own history and felt something crack inside them. Not all of them, not even most, but enough. Mutinies broke out on 37 ships in the first 12 hours. Garrison commanders on Tithe worlds refused orders to fire on civilian populations. A Dominion admiral named Sorkathan, who had been preparing to glass a rebellious colony, read the archive, looked at the world below her, and shut down her weapon systems with her own command codes before turning herself in to the local resistance. The center was not holding anymore. Keth Velen read the archive alone in his quarters aboard the Edict of Silence, and he read it very slowly, and when he finished, he sat in the dark for a long time with his 4 eyes closed and his massive hands resting on his knees. He thought about Keth the Unbroken, whose name he carried in his own, a hero who had freed his people and then betrayed every principle he had fought for. He thought about the 400 species that the Dominion had ground beneath its heel, each one a mirror of what the Varokai had once been. Thought about the silver-haired human admiral who had laughed in his face, who had fought with everything she had and lost half her fleet, and still smiled through the blood on her face. And he realized that he had been asking the wrong question for the entire war. He had been asking how to defeat the humans. The question he should have been asking was why they were not afraid. He opened a private communication channel, not a military frequency, but a civilian one, unencrypted, visible to anyone who cared to listen, and he waited. Vasquez answered from a medical frigate in the Elysium system, where she was recovering from injuries that would have killed a less stubborn woman. And when her face appeared on his screen, she looked tired in a way that went beyond the physical. The exhaustion of someone who had been carrying the weight of a species on her shoulders for months. But her eyes were still sharp, and when she saw Kethvalan's face on her display, she did not flinch or sneer or gloat. She just waited. "Why did you laugh?" Kethvalan asked. His voice was stripped of authority and rank and the weight of 10,000 years of empire, and what remained was something raw and simple, the voice of a person who genuinely did not understand and needed to. "Every species we have conquered wept or begged or raged," he continued. "Hundreds of civilizations, thousands of worlds, millions of years of history, and every single one of them responded to us with fear. But you laughed, from the very first moment you laughed, and I have spent this entire war trying to understand why." Vasquez looked at him for a long time, and her expression shifted into something that Kethvalan could not read, something that might have been sadness or compassion, or the particular gentleness of someone who understood pain because they had lived inside it. "Because we have been scared before," she said, and her voice was quiet, but steady. "We have faced extinction before. Ice ages that lasted 10,000 years. Plagues that killed half our population. Wars that came so close to ending us that the survivors could count themselves on their fingers. We built weapons that could have turned our own world to ash, and then we sat across tables from each other with our fingers on the buttons for 50 years. She paused and took a breath that rattled slightly in her damaged lungs. And every single time, we survived. Not because we were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced. We survived because when the universe told us to lie down and die, something inside us decided that was funny. That the sheer audacity of existence trying to snuff us out was so absurd that the only reasonable response was to laugh at it and keep going. She leaned forward, and her eyes held his across the light years. Fear is a choice, Cathvalan. Your people made that choice 12,000 years ago, when they decided to become the thing they were afraid of. And every species you have conquered since then made it when they decided that kneeling was easier than standing. We just made a different choice. We chose to laugh, and you cannot conquer a species that thinks the apocalypse is funny. Kezvalan was silent for a long time, and when he spoke again, his mandibles moved in a pattern that the translation software could not quite parse, but that Vasquez somehow understood as grief. We were slaves once, he said. We forgot. You do not have to stay what you became, Vasquez replied. That is the other thing humans learned from all those years of being terrible. You can always choose to be something else. It is never too late. The Treaty of Open Stars was signed 43 days later, in a neutral system chosen by the Scythene Collective, and it was not a surrender document, because no one surrendered. The Dominion did not fall. It transformed, painfully and slowly, imperfectly, like a bone that had to be rebroken in order to heal straight. Quetzvalan led the reformist faction that dismantled the tithe system and released the subject species from their bonds. And the process was messy and chaotic and sometimes violent, because 10,000 years of oppression could not be undone with a signature. But it was real, and it was happening, and for the first time in galactic memory, the direction of history was bending towards something other than conquest. The 400 liberated species formed the Free Assembly of Worlds, a body that had no emperor, and no hegemon, and no supreme authority of any kind. Just a vast, noisy, complicated gathering of civilizations, trying to figure out how to share a galaxy without crushing each other. Humanity was given a permanent seat at the assembly, and they accepted it with the explicit condition that they would never be placed above any other species, because, as Ambassador Joaquin Meade explained, with a grin that the Quelhari delegation was already learning to recognize, we did not do all of this to trade one boss for another. The inaugural session of the Free Assembly was held in a chamber so large that the far walls disappeared into haze, filled with representatives of hundreds of species, beings of chitin and crystal and flesh and light, some massive and some tiny, some ancient beyond reckoning, and some barely a generation removed from chains. Joaquin Meade stood at the central podium and looked out at the sea of alien faces, and for a moment, the sheer improbability of it all, a species of soft, slow, small-brained primates from an unremarkable world in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy, standing in the center of a new civilization built on the ashes of tyranny, seemed to catch in his throat. He blinked, steadied himself, and smiled. We have a saying on Earth, he said, and his voice carried through the vast chamber and was translated simultaneously into 400 languages. If you can laugh at it, you can live through it. He looked at the Quelhari delegation, where old Tolessa sat with her scars visible and her head held high for the first time in her long life. He looked at the Scythene representative, whose crystalline body chimed softly in the chamber's still air. He looked at Quetzvalan, who sat in the back row, wearing no insignia of rank, watching with an expression that his own people were still learning to recognize as something new. Well, Mead said, and his grin widened. Welcome to the other side. The chamber erupted. It was not applause. Most of these species did not clap, and many did not have hands, but a sound, a ripple of noise that started small and grew until it filled the vast space from floor to ceiling. 100 different species expressing something that many of them had never been allowed to express before. The Quelhari hummed in low harmonics. That vibrated the floor. The Scythene chimed in cascading frequencies that sounded like wind through crystal. The Draelkin survivors clicked their jaws in a rhythm that their ancestors had used to celebrate victories 1,000 years ago. And the Varokai, or at least the ones who had followed Keth Valen into this strange new future, struck their armored fists against their chests in a pattern that their history books said had once meant freedom, before the word was erased from their language. It was messy and uneven and sometimes discordant. Hundreds of biologies trying to express the same emotion through entirely different instruments. And it was the most beautiful sound the galaxy had ever produced. Because underneath all of it, threading through the hums and chimes and clicks and strikes like a current through deep water, was something unmistakable. Something that every being in that chamber recognized, regardless of their biology or their history. Their language. Laughter. The galaxy was laughing. And for the first time, it was laughing together.